Hey guys, Lonewolf here, and this is going to be my guide on how to use the jets in Battlefield 4. I'm going to focus on the attack jet, but a lot of this stuff will be applicable for the stealth jet as well. This is not going to be a basic guide. I'm not going to cover the ideal turning speed or anything like that. If you want to get started, there are plenty of good guides on the internet that will show you exactly how to fly your jet. This is going to be more of a guide for those who've already learned how to control their aircraft and want to make best use of what is a very powerful vehicle asset. Now there is a perception that if you're in a jet, you're really not helping your team and you're just being selfish and getting loads of kills and padding your own stats. And this can be true, but the main counter argument I see to this is, well, I'm getting lots of kills, so I'm helping my team that way. And this is a fairly depthless argument from my perspective. What you really should say is, I'm getting the right kills at the right time. And this is kind of the key with a lot of tactical gameplay, but especially in the jet, it's very easy to get kills. It's more difficult to get the right kills that are going to actually help your team out. When you're in the attack jet, you have a lot of advantages, but something rather obvious that's often overlooked is you have a massive height advantage over everyone. You can see everything, and you should be using that to spot as many people as possible. Even if you can't take them out yourself, it really helps your team to deal with them. You need to be a servant to your team on the ground. You need to be helping them out when they're trying to get objectives, and you need to be intercepting enemy vehicles before they become a threat. Ultimately, you cannot capture objectives. If you try to, you're going to end up like this. And so you really have to help your team. That's the only way you're going to be able to win games. Now ideally you do this with a squad on TeamSpeak or Skype or whatever the console equivalent of that is, but even if you're just playing with random teammates, you can encourage them onto an objective by thinning out the enemy force guarding it. If you can kill a tank or a couple of infantry and they see that that force is depleted, there's a good chance they will push up, certainly a much greater chance than if those tanks remain where they are. You have to acknowledge the fact that by and large, random teammates are not going to have great objective game sense. You are not going to be able to encourage them to take another objective in a very different direction just by clearing out some tanks and infantry over there. Some people are going to do this, and if you're communicating with people, absolutely do that. It's the best way to win if you can take objectives that are least guarded. They all have the same ticket bleed value, so you might as well just take the easier ones. But when you're dealing with a random team, chances are they're just going to be moving in one direction, and that's where they want to go. So if you can help them and you can assist them in taking that extra objective, then they can build up a line there and stop the enemy team coming in, at which point you can start thinning out enemy vehicles and infantry that are trying to attack them. So let's talk about how you do that, how you become as effective a force as possible at killing enemy infantry and enemy vehicles. The first thing you have to do is guarantee your own safety, and the more efficiently you can do this, the more time you're going to have to help your team on the ground. There are two major threats to you when you're in a jet. The first is other jets, and the other is the mobile anti-air. Everything else falls under varying degrees of nuisance that won't really be a problem for you unless you're careless. Now when it comes to dealing with enemy jets, there are going to be a lot of people who teach you how to dogfight, and I'm not going to be one of them because there are plenty of good guides for this, and it's not something I do very often. I don't find dogfights to be a very effective way of dealing with enemy jets. I lose probably less than 5% of the jet fights I get into, and it's because I don't dogfight. I'm not going to let it get that far. I really don't want to be looping around and getting it to a point where just a minor mistake on my part gets me killed. I want to take them out before it gets to that stage. So what you really need to do is have a mental note of when the jet was last destroyed. I personally can do this in my head, but if you can't, then a stopwatch on the desk may be a way to go. And what you want to do is, when you know the jet's going to be approaching, you want to get out of that center area of the map where they can spot you very easily. You want to be on the sidelines or above, somewhere where they're going to be tempted to just go for a ground target. Then when they take a pass on one of your tanks, good chance is that that tank is going to have active protection, so they're not going to be destroyed by it, and you can then swoop in and kill that jet from behind or above or from the side. That's a much more effective way of doing it. Same thing really goes for stealth jets. They may not be able to attack tanks on the ground, but in all likelihood they're going to go for the attack chopper if there is one, or perhaps your other jet, something like this. And if you can get out of the way and encourage them to just go for another target, then you're going to have the drop on them. That's going to make things much easier for you. If, however, you don't manage this, perhaps you're preoccupied with something else or just weren't paying attention, then you're no longer guaranteed a victory, and your probability of winning relies upon two things. The first is how soon you identify they're approaching, and the other is whether or not they decide to prioritize you as their first target. The closer they get, the more difficult it's going to be for you to react, and if they get within 200 meters of you and you still don't know they're there, then you've made yourself a very obvious target, and the chances of them going for something else before they take you out as what they perceive to be an easy kill is very minimal. You really don't stand much of a chance at this point, so you absolutely need to see them coming well in advance. This is why it's so important for people on the ground to spot incoming jets. It just makes the life of pilots a lot easier and gives them a much greater chance of maintaining air superiority. But what about if you do know their jet's coming? Let's say it's 800 meters out and it's quite clearly seen you. What do you do then? Well, the first thing you have to do is disengage from the center of the map, disengage from combat, and start a very wide arc. Just maintain the same distance between you and the incoming threat. And this serves two purposes. The first is to try and identify whether or not it's tracking you and painted you as its primary target. If it has, it's going to follow your movements. And the other is that by moving in this way, you're actually going to discourage it from following you. It's more likely to go for something else. And this is the ideal situation. When it doesn't come for you, then you have a much better chance of getting to the side or behind it and taking it out while it's busy with something else. More often than not, this is what's going to happen. You're one of just many vehicles on the battlefield, and if you're flying consistently away from them, then you're the least appealing target, and unless you've been particularly troublesome for their team, chances are they're going to go for something else instead. However, if they do track you, then you have a couple of options. The first is to use ground assets to your advantage. The stationary AA at your base, or potentially a friendly in the mobile anti-air or DV-15 or rib boat, those could all be effective, but as regards player controlled items, then that's going to have to depend upon your team being fairly alert, and probably this is only going to work if you're with a squad who you're communicating with and you can ask them to assist you. But the stationary AA works anyway, you just need to make sure you spot them in advance. This is going to force them to turn around, and then you can loop and get behind them. This is a very effective tactic. It's one that a lot of people use, and there's a good reason for that. If none of these options is available to you to swing that fight in your favor, then you have to fly straight at them. You need to limit the amount of time that you're in front of them where their guns can hit you, and you want to point your guns at them, and then you want to be behind them. So turn at them as fast as you can and then go towards them as fast as you can. As you approach them, make sure you break away early. There's two reasons for this. First is you do not want to be ramming into them. I can't tell you how often this happens and just gets you both killed. And the other is that if you turn early, then you're going to get a slight advantage as far as looping them is concerned, providing you know where they are because you've spotted them and you can see where they're maneuvering. Perhaps you can follow the jet trails. Then you should be able to mirror their movements and get behind them eventually. Like I said, I'm not going to go into dogfights. There are plenty of good guides on this, and at this stage you are in a dogfighting position. Having said this, I will note that stress and confidence are very important factors going into a dogfight, so make sure you do as much damage as possible on your approach. Not least of all because you'd like to take them out there and then, but also because going into a dogfight with low health is going to stress most pilots. Also, if you show yourself to be accurate, there's a good chance they'll mistake you for a better pilot than you actually are. If this makes them feel even a little bit insecure, then that's a good thing. Dogfights are not so much about reaction time as they are intelligence, keeping your cool and forcing the opponent to make a mistake first. So any psychological advantage you can get over your opponent has got to be a good thing. Now I should probably mention missiles on jets. It's very unusual to come across a good jet pilot who's using missiles. For the most part, they'll want the versatility to engage ground targets with the stealth jet with laser bombs, and they'll want that little bit of extra firepower on the attack jet as well. So you're quite unlikely to come across this, but if you do, again, just turn towards them and pop your flares early enough that you're not going to get hit with a missile, then you'll be behind them and it won't be a problem anymore, much like with the guns. As far as ground missiles are concerned, the anti-air is a bit of a different one, and I'll cover that in a second, but as far as man-pads are concerned, that's the Stinger and the Igla. Because you're moving so much faster than they can possibly hope to keep up with, providing you pop your flares as you fly over, they're not going to be able to get a second lock, and you can just loop around the perimeter for a little bit while your flares recharge. You can also use the terrain to interrupt their lock. It's pretty easy to avoid these, and if they are denying you access to an area with several people using Stingers, then at that point they're not very effective countering infantry, and their team's in a pretty bad way anyway. When it comes to the mobile anti-aircraft, this is a lot more difficult to counter, and it's the one I have the most difficulty with. The anti-aircraft may only be able to look up about 80 degrees, but if it positions itself on the edge of a hill, like a lot of those very stubborn campers at the back of the map do, then it's going to be much more difficult, because at that point it can look directly up as well. Now, the best way I've found to deal with the anti-aircraft is if it's moving, and if it's engaging something else, and obviously you can shoot at it and drop bombs on it just like you would with tanks, but if it's stationary at the back of the map, then try and go at it from an angle where it doesn't see you coming. Come at enough altitude, or come at it from the side, perhaps from behind some terrain, and drop 2 JDAMs on it. If it's not moving, then you can do this at range, and it's very effective. The 2 bombs will land directly after one another, and it'll do 100 damage before they've had a chance to pop their APS. This is the way I'd recommend you do this. It does take some practice. It is quite a challenging thing to do, but it's by far the most effective technique I've found so far. If the AA does start shooting at you and you're quite high, just get even higher, try and loop around, and it's not going to be able to do a whole lot to you up there. If you're quite low, however, then dive even lower to the terrain and just try and interfere with its line of sight. Do not put yourself at that intermediate altitude where you're the easiest target for it to hit. If it starts shooting missiles at you, then you're just going to have to pop your flares, and if you don't have flares, then when you absorb the hit, the aircraft is going to try and roll in a particular direction. Roll with it, don't try and fight it, roll around, and as you roll, make minute pitch adjustments when the top of your aircraft faces the direction you want to maneuver. In this way, you'll be able to keep flying in a straight line instead of banking off and hitting something on the ground. Once again, it's very important that your team works with you. If you have a good wingman in the other jet, that can be very helpful. It's also very useful if your team are willing to engage the anti-aircraft on the ground as a matter of priority. And likewise, if it's one of those maps where there's only one AA and your team fights for control of the position that spawns it, that makes a huge difference to the balance of power in the air, and likewise across the entire map as a result. So with the anti-aircraft and the jets out of the way, what about other targets on the battlefield? Well, the helicopters potentially are going to be a bit of a threat to you. They both have the option to use heat seekers, and the miniguns on the scout helicopter can absolutely shred you in the hands of a good pilot. But there's a very easy counter to this. Helicopters cannot pitch up, they cannot look up for an extended period of time. If they do, they're going to hit their tail on the ground and explode. They can't maintain their altitude, so you just need to fly up in the air and come down from on top of them. Absolutely the best way to deal with them, it's really just that simple. The attack boat is something you need to watch out for. It's got miniguns on the back, it's probably got active protection, and the driver could be using burst cannons. Some drivers, including myself, will also try and hit you with TV missiles. This can be extremely effective, so you just need to watch out for that incoming missile. In my view, the best way to deal with enemy attack boats as well as land armor is to use the JDAMs. I mentioned this before, but I think they're the best loadout decision. All you need to do is approach from a steep angle, do 50 damage with your 30mm, and then as you start to pitch up, switch over to the JDAM and drop it on top of that vehicle. This will take some practice to get the timing right, but once you do, you're able to do the most damage in one pass, and you can make that pass shorter because you only have to do 50 damage with the guns before you can switch over and start pitching up. Now I say come in from a steep angle because especially if you're going against a good tank driver with sabot shells, you're actually quite an easy target to hit if you're too low. This is not a rarity, it's something that happens for me fairly often, is that when I'm driving a tank I can hit jets that are just too low to the ground, so don't be careless and come in too shallow. So what about infantry targets? Well, they're unarmoured, so they're going to drop a lot quicker if you can hit them, but they're also a lot smaller, so they're going to be harder to hit in the first place. Much like with the Hydra rockets, the JDAMs are capable of taking out infantry, and it does take some practice, but I recommend you give this a try. I would say that these days I get about half my jet kills against infantry, so it's an incredibly effective thing to do, and it just expands your target pool a lot further than if you run something like laser bombs, and you can only hit vehicles. It's especially useful if your team's trying to capture an objective, and there's infantry on a roof or on a hilltop or perhaps behind some cover. You can go in and you can take those people out for your team. That's pretty much most of the stuff I wanted to talk about in this tutorial, but I've just got a few more miscellaneous tips that I wanted to mention. The first is, as you attack an enemy helicopter, make sure you break away nice and early, because otherwise you're going to end up hitting the wreckage once it's been destroyed. I do this all the time, and it's probably the #1 reason I get killed is hitting enemy aircraft wreckage. Next thing, if you're going to go for a roadkill against an enemy parachuter or swimmer, make sure that you slow down a little bit, because if you hit them at full speed, then you're going to sustain about 10 damage but also a vehicle disable. This can be quite humiliating if it really messes you up and you end up hitting terrain or ditching in the water. Also, if you hit trees on the ground, make sure you jump out immediately. If you maintain pressure on the throttle, you're just going to explode. But if you jump out, the jet is just going to stop still where it is, and you're going to have the opportunity to get back in it and then try and take off again. I've got some footage here that will show you exactly what I'm talking about. I'm not sure why this is the case, it's just one of those weird anomalies. And last of all, if you see an enemy jet in the air that's empty, this happens a lot, people bail out a lot, you need to make an assessment as to whether or not you think you can reasonably swap into it. I've actually done this several times. I'm going to try and put some footage up here as well, and it's reasonably viable. I've succeeded in doing this more times than not when I try. This is because I make a decision fairly early on whether I'm going to be able to get into it before it hits the ground. I'm not too worried about actually missing it. I don't think I've ever done that more than maybe once or twice, but if you can take control of their jet, you have a massive advantage for the remainder of the game, and if you can do this, I'd recommend you do. It's a bit of a risk, and if you don't feel confident enough to do it, then don't, but if you do, give it a try, because it's actually something I've found remarkably viable over the last year. Now in finishing, I just want to stress that if you spawn into a jet, really any jet, but especially the attack jet, then you have a huge amount of power at your disposal, but also a huge amount of responsibility to your team. It is not fair for you to use a jet as transport to get you to the middle of the map faster. It just puts your team at a massive disadvantage. Likewise, if you really can't fly, and I mean really can't fly, and you're likely just to hit things, then you should be learning how to control the aircraft in the test range before you come over to a public game to try your hand at combat. I'm not saying that somebody who's just a slightly worse pilot than somebody else shouldn't be using the jet. Of course they should be learning how to get better at combat, but if you're just going to hit things, then you really shouldn't be wasting that vehicle asset for your team. Anyway, that pretty much wraps it up. Thank you very much for watching. Let me know what you thought of this tutorial. I hope you found it useful and interesting, and I'll see you next time.